I woke up before sunrise on my 76th birthday, the way I always do. Not because of any alarm, not because of discomfort or worry or any of the things that people assume wake older men in the dark hours of the morning. I've woken before sunrise my entire adult life. 40 years of railway signal work does that to a person. It builds into your biology a relationship with the pre-dawn hours that outlasts the work itself, that persists through retirement and quiet years and the gradual rearrangement of your days from schedules into something more personal. At 5:20 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, my body simply decided it was time, the way it always did, and I lay in the dark of the bedroom at 42 Briarwood Lane and listened to Asheville waking up around me. There were cars outside. That was the first thing that registered as different. Not alarming, just different. Briarwood Lane is a quiet street. It has been a quiet street for the 42 years I've lived on it. The kind of street where you know the sound of every neighbor's car and the rhythm of the mail truck and the specific quality of quiet that settles at this hour on an ordinary morning. What I was hearing was not that ordinary quiet. There were vehicles in the driveway and on the street in front of the house. I could tell by the way the pre-dawn light from the street lamp was being interrupted by shapes that weren't usually there. I got up, put on the flannel shirt from the chair beside the bed, went to the window. 3 cars. I recognized all of them. For a moment, I simply stood at the window and looked at those 3 cars and felt something that I'm going to be honest about, because being honest about it is the only way this story makes any sense. I felt glad. I felt the specific gladness of a 76-year-old man who has lived alone for several years and who has spent the past few birthdays in the particular quiet that follows the loss of a person who used to make ordinary days feel like occasions worth noting. I stood at that window and I thought, they came. I went downstairs. The kitchen was already lit. There was a smell, coffee and something baked, and the particular combination of morning food being prepared by people who were trying to do it right. My eldest son, Nathan, was at the counter. Caroline was setting the table. Peter was sitting in the chair by the window with a coffee mug and an expression I didn't fully read at the time, though I've thought about it many times since. There was a birthday cake on the counter with unlighted candles. There were wrapped gifts stacked on the side table. There were handwritten cards propped against the fruit bowl. Caroline looked up when I came in. She said, "Dad, today is going to be different." She said it with the warmth she uses when she wants something to feel certain. I believed her. I believed her because I wanted to, which is the honest answer, and because everything visible in that kitchen seemed to support believing her. My 3 children in my kitchen before sunrise on my birthday, with food and cards and a cake and the evidence of planning, of effort, of intention, of caring enough to get into their cars and drive to Asheville and be there when I came downstairs. I believed her completely. And I sat down at the kitchen table, and Nathan put coffee in front of me, and Peter made the kind of half-joke he makes when he's trying to fill a space, and we had breakfast together, in the way we hadn't had breakfast together in longer than I could immediately calculate. It was a good morning. I want to be precise about that, because what came later doesn't make full sense, unless you understand that the morning before it was genuinely good, not performed. Not the surface warmth of people going through motions. A real morning, with real food and real conversation, and the real pleasure of being in the company of people you love and have loved for their entire lives. The afternoon was different. We moved to the living room after lunch. The birthday cake was still on the counter. Nobody had mentioned lighting the candles, which I'd noticed but attributed to timing, to the meal having its own momentum. Nathan said he wanted to talk. He used that specific phrasing. I want to talk. Not, can we discuss something, or there's something on my mind. The deliberate, prepared phrasing of someone who has organized what they intend to say. We sat down. Nathan placed a folder on the dining table. I looked at the folder, and then at my children, and I noticed something I should have noticed earlier in the day. None of them were quite at ease. Not Nathan, who had the quality he gets when he's implemented a plan and is waiting to see how the implementation lands. Not Caroline, who was doing the thing she does when she wants to appear calm about something that is making her uncalm, a particular stillness that isn't relaxation but the performance of it. Not Peter, who had been slightly off throughout the day in a way I'd attributed to tiredness from the drive from Tennessee. Nathan said, "Dad, we've made arrangements for you to stay somewhere else." I looked at him. I genuinely believed for about 3 seconds that he was joking. It had the structure of a setup, the serious delivery followed by a punchline that I was waiting for. We were going somewhere for the evening, perhaps. A restaurant they'd booked, a trip they'd organized. I waited for the punchline. Nathan slid a printed itinerary across the table. A reservation, a specific residence, a room, an address several hours from Asheville, check-in date 2 days from now. I looked at the paper. I looked at the paper for long enough to understand completely what I was looking at, and then I looked at my children. Caroline was not meeting my eyes. Peter was looking at his hands. I heard myself ask very quietly, "Did any of you think to ask me where I wanted to spend my 76th birthday?" Nobody answered. Then I saw the box. I don't know how I hadn't seen it earlier. It was beside the front door, not hidden, not placed out of sight. A small cardboard box, sealed with tape, with my name written on the side. My handwriting. Unmistakably mine. The printing I've used my whole life. The specific way I formed the letters of Walter Harlan that I would know anywhere. I had no memory of packing it. And that, in the particular way that a detail lands when everything around it has shifted the context for how you receive information, was the thing that made the rest of it real in a way that the folder hadn't quite managed. A folder can be a mistake. A reservation can be a misunderstanding. A box with your name on it, packed in your own handwriting, sitting beside your own front door. That is something that was planned. That was prepared for. That was done in advance of the conversation still happening at the dining table. I said, "How long have you been planning this?" Nathan said, "A few months." I looked at the table. A few months. I thought about the past few months. The Sunday calls I'd made to each of them. The calls where I'd talked about the repair I was doing on the back fence and the new radio program I'd found and the autumn in the mountains this year. How the color had come in later than usual, and with a particular intensity that the mountains sometimes achieve in October when the conditions are exactly right. I thought about the birthday cards I'd bought for Nathan's birthday in August, and Caroline's in September, and the calls I'd made on each of those days. I thought about the ordinary continuity of the past few months, the apparent normalcy of it, the sense I'd had that things were simply busy for everyone in the particular way of adult lives that have their own full weight. They had been planning where I would live while I had been calling them every Sunday. I said, "And nobody thought I deserved to know?" Caroline said quietly. "We were afraid you'd refuse." I said, "You were right." I said it without heat. Not sarcastically, not as a weapon. I said it because it was simply true, and because saying it simply and truly seemed more important than any other approach in that particular moment. Then I looked at Peter. Peter was 39 years old, the youngest of my three, a commercial photographer who has always been the most emotionally visible of the three, in the specific sense that what he's feeling is usually somewhere on his face, whether he intends it to be or not. He was looking at his hands. He had been looking at his hands for most of the past 10 minutes, and I had been noting that without commenting on it, and now I noticed it with additional attention, because Peter not looking at me in a moment like this meant something specific. He knew something. I didn't ask him about it then. I've worked around machinery my entire career, and one thing 40 years of signal work teaches you is that the right moment to address something is not always the first available moment. You learn to read timing. You learn that some information is best pursued after other information has been allowed to settle. I looked at Peter for a moment and made a note of what I saw, and I returned to the question of the box. I walked to the front door. I opened the box. Inside, a wristwatch. My own, the one I'd been given by the railway when I completed 30 years of service. A watch I wore every day until Ellen died, and then put in the drawer beside my bed because wearing it felt like continuing something she had always admired, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. A photograph. Ellen and me, taken at a specific place in the mountains east of Asheville, that we'd gone to every anniversary we could manage for the first 20 years of our marriage. A small notebook. My flannel shirt, not the one I was wearing, the other one, the blue one that Ellen had given me the last Christmas before she got sick. A brass key, and a handwritten list of dates on a folded piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting on the list immediately, my own. 42 years of writing maintenance logs and signal reports and route assessments and repair notes in the same hand, and there it was on a folded piece of paper inside a cardboard box beside my front door. In my own printing. The dates went back almost 2 years. I stood at the front door with the box open in my hands, and I thought about something that I was going to need to decide how to explain. And I thought about the timing of the explanation. And I thought about Peter looking at his hands. And I thought about a conversation I'd had with myself, alone, in this house, about 4 months ago, that nobody else knew had happened. Let me tell you about the house before I tell you what the box meant. 42 Briarwood Lane. I moved in 1982, Ellen and I. We'd been married for 3 years, and we'd been living in a rented apartment on the north side of the city, which was fine for 2 people just starting out, but which had the specific limitations of a rented apartment. Walls that weren't yours. Decisions that required permission. The fundamental impermanence of a space you're borrowing rather than inhabiting. When we found the house on Briarwood Lane, we weren't looking for something impressive. We were looking for something that was ours. That was the whole criterion. The house qualified. It was a modest 2-story on a quiet street built in the 60s, with a covered porch and a garage and a backyard that became, over the years, one of the places I spent most of my time when I wasn't working. I know every room of that house the way I know every section of the signal systems I spent my career maintaining. Not just the surface, not just what's visible, but the underlying structure, the specific places where the house is perfectly itself, and the specific places where it has its own quirks that you accommodate rather than fix, because accommodating them is now part of how you understand the building. Ellen became the house as much as the house became her. That's not a sentimental statement. It's a practical observation. She organized it. She made decisions about it. She chose what went on the walls and what went in the garden and how the kitchen should be arranged and what should happen with the back bedroom that we'd initially planned to use one way and eventually used another. When she died, the house was full of her decisions. Every room contained her thinking. That was, for the first year, a comfort. Then it became something more complicated. Not painful exactly. More like weight. The specific weight of a space that holds more history than one person can easily carry. I want to be honest about that because it matters to understanding why the cardboard box beside the front door on my 76th birthday was not what my children assumed it was. About 4 months before the birthday, on an evening in late June, I had sat in the armchair by the living room window, and I had done something I hadn't done before. I had allowed myself to think, without deflecting or redirecting, about what I actually wanted the next years of my life to look like. Not what was expected, not what was manageable, what I actually wanted. The answer that emerged from that thinking surprised me enough that I sat with it for several weeks before I did anything about it. I did not want to stay in the house. Let me be precise. I didn't want to leave because I was incapable of staying. I was perfectly capable of staying. I managed the house well. I maintained it. I paid for it. I made decisions about it. The idea that I was somehow unable to continue in my own home was not a factor in my thinking at any point. I wanted to leave because the house had become, quietly and over the course of several years, a monument to a life that was past rather than a home for a life that was continuing. And I was still a person with a continuing life, and I had decided, sitting in the armchair on that June evening, that a continuing life deserved a space that matched it. I had begun researching cottages in a mountain community about 40 minutes from Asheville. Small, manageable, in a setting with the particular quality of the mountains that I had always found restorative. I had found one that was available. I had looked at it twice. I had planned to tell my children on my birthday. The box by the door contained the first few things I had identified as belonging to the next chapter. Not everything, not the bulk of what I would take with me when I eventually made the move. Just the first few things. The watch, because it connected to 40 years of work I was proud of. The photograph, because that place in the mountains was one of the places I intended to revisit. The notebook, because it contained thoughts I wanted to keep close. The flannel shirt, the brass key to a storage unit where I'd been keeping several things I knew I wanted in a new space. And the list of dates. The list was what I want to explain carefully, because it was the thing that told me most about what the day had become. The dates on the list were not random. They were observations. 2 years of observations recorded in my own printing, of small things I had noticed about my children's behavior that I had been noting without knowing quite what to make of. Missed calls that didn't get returned for longer than usual. Dinners canceled at short notice. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room. Nathan's increasing interest in specific aspects of the house. Questions about the roof, about the heating system, about whether I'd had the plumbing assessed recently. The kind of questions that are perfectly ordinary from a son who cares about his father's home, but that accumulate over time into a pattern with a shape. Caroline asking about my schedule in a way that was slightly more organized than casual concern would require. Whether I drove at night, whether I'd seen the doctor recently, whether I had friends who checked in on me regularly. Peter going quiet at specific moments in specific conversations. The moments when certain subjects came up. The moments I'd noticed him look at Nathan the way you look at someone when you're both carrying information the third party doesn't have. I had noted all of it without knowing what it meant. I had written it down because I was a signal technician for 40 years, and writing things down is what you do when you notice patterns you can't yet interpret. You document, you date, you keep the record so that when the interpretation eventually arrives, you have the data to verify it against. The interpretation had arrived, not the way I'd imagined it would arrive. I stood at the front door of my house on Briarwood Lane, and I held the box, and I looked at my children in the living room, and I understood that we were in a situation with a particular geometry. They had been making a plan for my life. I had been making a plan for my life. The plans had arrived at the same moment without any of us knowing that the other plan existed, which meant that the thing they had organized, the folder, the reservation, the itinerary, was not simply an imposition on a man who had not been thinking about his future. It was an imposition on a man who had been thinking about nothing else for 4 months. And the difference between those two things was the whole story. Nathan said, from the living room, "Dad, the box has some things we thought you'd want to take." I set the box down on the floor. I said, "Who packed this?" Silence. I said, "I want to know who was in my bedroom." Caroline said, "We wanted to help." I said, "You went into my bedroom without asking me." A different kind of silence. The day had a shape now. I could see the shape of it clearly in the way that a signal problem becomes clear when you've traced every component and identified every variable. The birthday breakfast had been real, but it had also been the opening of something planned. The gifts and cards had been genuine in some respects and had also been the first stage of a conversation that was always going to end at the table with a folder and an itinerary. The cake still had unlighted candles. I looked at it. Then I looked at Peter, who had finally raised his eyes from his hands, who was now looking at me with the specific expression of a person who has been present for something that has gone wrong, and who has known it was going to go wrong, and who has been carrying the knowledge of that for longer than was comfortable. He said, "Dad." One word. But the way he said it told me that there was something he needed to tell me, something separate from what Nathan had organized, and separate from what Caroline had supported, and something that, when I heard it, was going to change the shape of the day further in a direction I wasn't yet anticipating. I said, "Peter." He looked at Nathan. Nathan said carefully, "We should probably let Dad look at the itinerary before we—" "Dad," Peter said again. Not louder, but with the specific quality of someone who has decided that the thing they've been not saying is now more important than the reason they'd been not saying it. He said, "There's something about why Nathan organized this the way he did. Something he didn't tell you. And I think you need to know it before we go any further." Nathan said, "Peter." "No," Peter said. And this time the word had something in it that I recognized from when Peter was much younger and had made a decision he was going to hold regardless of who pushed back. "No, he has to know." The room went completely still. I looked at my youngest son, who had his mother's eyes and his own particular way of arriving at a moment of courage from an unexpected direction, and I waited for him to tell me what he'd been carrying since he drove up from Tennessee, what he said next, what Nathan had found, and what he'd done with what he found, and how a letter I'd written decades ago to a woman I loved had become the foundation for a decision made about my life without my knowledge, was the thing that changed everything. Not the folder, not the itinerary, not the box, the letter. Peter said, "Nathan found a letter." The room had the specific quality of a room where something important is being said, and everyone present knows it and nobody is moving. Nathan was sitting very straight. Caroline had her hands in her lap. Peter was looking at me with the particular expression of someone who has made a decision they believe is right and who is now living in the moment after making it, where the rightness is still true, but the cost of it is becoming real. I said, "What letter?" Peter said, "One you wrote to Mom." I looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "Dad, let him finish," I said. Peter continued. He said that Nathan, about 6 months ago, had been at the house helping me with a repair, a visit I remembered clearly, a Saturday in April when we'd replaced some boards on the back porch, and Nathan had stayed for lunch, and we'd talked about the mountains and about his work in Charlotte. After I'd gone to rest after lunch, Nathan had been in the study looking for a tape measure. He found a letter instead, not hidden, not locked away, in the small wooden box on the bookshelf in the study where I'd kept a few personal things from the years of our marriage. Not sentimental display pieces, more like a private archive, the things too specific to put on a wall but too important to put out of reach entirely. The box was not sealed. It wasn't marked private. It was simply there, on the shelf, the way it had been for years. Nathan had opened it looking for the tape measure and had found the letter. He had read it. He told Peter about it. Then Caroline. And what he told them became the foundation on which the next 6 months had been constructed. I said, "Tell me what the letter said." Peter looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "It was a letter you wrote to Mom, before I was born, when you were first married." "I know which letter," I said. He looked slightly surprised by that. "I kept a carbon copy," I said, "in the same box." Nathan said, "You wrote that you never wanted us, your children, to feel responsible for you when you got old. You wrote that you had seen what happened in families where the older generation became a burden and you didn't want that. You wrote that you would rather—" He stopped for a moment, as though the words were harder to say than he'd anticipated. "You wrote that you would rather face whatever came alone than have your children feel obligated to manage your life." The room was quiet. I said, "Yes." "You wrote that," Nathan said. "I did," I said. "I wrote that in 1979. I was 27 years old. Your mother and I had been married for 8 months." Nathan said, "I know what you thought," I said. And here is where I have to be careful about something. Because Nathan's interpretation of that letter was not dishonest. It wasn't cynical or self-serving or an excuse to do something he'd already wanted to do for different reasons. He read a letter written by a 27-year-old man to his new wife, and he interpreted it as a statement of his father's permanent wishes, And that interpretation was understandable in exactly the way that interpretations made from incomplete context always are. They follow logically from the information available, and they are wrong in the specific way that logic built on incomplete information is always wrong. Nathan had taken a letter that described one fear, the fear of becoming a burden, and had constructed from it an entire philosophy about what his father wanted, without asking his father whether that fear, almost 50 years later, still defined his wishes in the same way. I said, "That letter was written the year your mother and I moved into this house. We had nothing. We had furniture we'd found and fixed, and a house that needed work and 2 incomes that we were careful with because we had to be. And I had watched my parents, your grandparents, spend their final years in a dynamic with their own children that I found painful to witness. Your grandfather refused to accept help. Your grandmother accepted too much and became dependent in a way that damaged her relationship with my aunts and uncles. I wrote that letter because I was 27 and I believed there was a correct way to age and I believed I had identified it. I looked at my children. I was 27, I said again. I was wrong about a great many things I believed at 27. Not all of them, but many." Nathan said, "You still believe in independence." "I do," I said. "But independence is not the same thing as isolation, Nathan. And the letter you read was written by a man who was afraid of one and confused it with the other." Peter said, "That's what I told him." Nathan looked at his brother. "You told me his situation had changed." "Yes," Peter said, "and I was right." "And I told you," Nathan said, with the measured quality of a person making a point they believe is reasonable, "that a man who spent his entire life insisting he didn't need help from anyone wasn't going to change that conviction because we asked him nicely." There it was. That was the belief at the center of the whole thing. Not that Nathan was trying to hurt me. Not that Caroline had stopped caring about my preferences. Not that Peter had been indifferent. Nathan had built a picture of his father from a specific collection of materials. The letter. 40 years of watching me handle things without asking for assistance. A genuine concern about my well-being. And the picture he'd built was accurate in its components and wrong in its conclusion. He saw a man who had never asked for help and believed he was seeing a man who never would. He didn't consider the possibility that the man might have been in the process of changing his own mind. I sat down at the table. Not because I was tired, because sitting down communicated something specific. I was not leaving the conversation. I was not retreating. I was not performing the kind of anger that requires standing up and movement. I was staying at the table, which is where the conversation needed to happen. I said, "Nathan, do you remember the Saturday in April when you helped me with the porch?" He said, "Yes." "Do you remember what we talked about at lunch?" He thought, "The mountains, your work projects, my work in Charlotte." "Do you remember what I asked you about the community near Weaverville? The one with the smaller homes, up near the trailhead?" He looked at me. "You mentioned a drive you'd taken." "I mentioned more than a drive," I said. "I mentioned that I was thinking about what the next stage of my life might look like. You told me that I didn't need to think about that. You said the house was fine and I was fine and we could talk about all of that later." A pause. "You changed the subject," I said. "And I let you because I thought it was too early in the conversation. I thought there would be more time." Nathan was quiet. "There was no more time," I said, "because by then you had already read the letter and you had already begun the process of deciding what my future looked like. The conversation I was trying to start with you, the one about what I actually wanted, was happening at the same time as the conversation you were having with your brother and sister about what you had decided." Caroline said, "Dad." Her voice was not the organized, calm voice she'd been using. This was the other voice, the one she has when she's not managing something but simply speaking. "We were scared." I looked at her. "Not just about your safety," she said. "About about watching it, about being the person who was supposed to know what to do. Mom always knew what to do. She always had a plan for everything, and a way of making the plan feel like the right thing. And since she died, I keep thinking that somebody has to be the one who knows what to do, and I keep not knowing, and she stopped. This felt like knowing what to do, she said quietly, even if it was wrong. That was the most honest thing that had been said in the room since Peter spoke. I thought about what Caroline had just told me, about her mother always knowing what to do, about the specific grief of losing the person in a family who holds the practical intelligence together, the one who translates everyone's needs into action. Ellen had been that person. I had been the one who repaired things and maintained things, but Ellen had been the one who knew what people needed before they knew it themselves. And when she died, that function had not been replaced. It had simply been absent. And the absence of it had created a pressure that each of my children had been managing in their own way. Nathan managed it by creating structure where none existed. Caroline managed it by supporting structure when someone else created it. Peter managed it by watching and worrying and ultimately deciding that silence was no longer the right response. None of them had managed it by asking their father what he needed, and I had not helped them. Let me be honest about that, because the story doesn't make full sense without my part in it. I had spent 40 years being the person who handled things, the signal technician who arrived at the problem and diagnosed it and fixed it and documented it and moved to the next one. That approach had served me well in my career and had also, in ways I was slower to recognize, created a specific expectation in my children about what I was. I was not a person who needed things. I was a person who provided them. That identity had been so consistent and so long-standing that my children had incorporated it into their understanding of me at a level that was almost structural. And when circumstances began changing, when the house became heavier with memory, when I started taking drives to Weaverville, when I began the research I hadn't yet told anyone about, they didn't recognize the change because I had given them no framework for recognizing it. I had been quietly becoming a different version of myself. They were still responding to the previous one. I reached into the box and I took out the notebook. The notebook was not large, the kind you buy at any stationery store, with the cardboard cover and the lined pages. I had started it about 8 months ago, before the letter, before Nathan's visit in April, before any of the conversations that had led to this day. I had started it because I had developed a habit in the years since my retirement of writing things down when I was working through something. Not a journal in the conventional sense, more like the documentation process I'd used for 4 decades in professional life, applied to something more personal. I set it on the table. I said, "This is not a document I intended you to see, but given what's happened today, I think you should read parts of it." They looked at the notebook. Nathan said, "What is it?" "It's me," I said. "The version of me from the past 8 months, not the version from 1979. The current one." I opened it to a page I'd marked about 3 weeks earlier. I read the first paragraph aloud. I had written, "The house is beautiful. It has always been beautiful, in the specific way that a thing you built and maintained for 4 decades becomes beautiful. Not because of its appearance, but because of the work that went into it and the years it witnessed. But beauty is not the same as belonging, and I have been thinking about whether this is still the place I belong. Ellen is in every room, and that was once a comfort and has become, without my choosing it, a kind of gravity. I love her presence here. I am also ready for a space that is mine rather than ours. Those two things are both true at the same time." I closed the notebook. The room was very quiet. Peter said, "You were already thinking about leaving." "Yes," I said. "Before any of this," he said. "Before any of this." Nathan said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And this was the question I had been expecting since the morning. The question that deserved the fullest answer I could give it. I said, because every time I tried to talk about getting older, you changed the subject. Nathan started to respond. I said, not just you, all of you. I would mention something, a drive I'd taken, a community I'd looked at, a question I had about what things might look like differently, and one of you would redirect to the weather, to your work, to something that was happening in your lives, sometimes gently, sometimes less gently, but consistently. I paused. I learned over time that you didn't want to have that conversation, and because I didn't want to force it, I stopped trying to start it. That's not, Caroline began. It's not a criticism, I said. It's an observation. You didn't want to hear that I was thinking about my future because hearing it made the future feel present, and the future feeling present was something that frightened you. She didn't deny it. I said, you were afraid of what it meant to start those conversations, what it would require of you, what it would change, and so you didn't start them. And I didn't push. And the gap between what I was thinking and what you knew I was thinking grew until it was wide enough for a plan to form in that gap that I didn't know about. Nathan said, we were trying to help. I know, I said. That's the part that matters most, actually. Not the folder, not the reservation. The fact that you were frightened and you loved me, and instead of telling me you were frightened and asking me what I wanted, you found a different way to manage the fear. He looked at me. You weren't protecting me from my future, I said. You were protecting yourselves from having to ask me what I wanted. The room received that sentence the way rooms receive things that are entirely true, with the specific silence of people who are not arguing because the thing cannot be argued with. I want to stop here and say something directly, because this is the part of the story where I think the most important thing needs to be named clearly. What Nathan and Caroline and Peter had done was not cruel. It was not selfish in the simple way that the word selfish usually implies. It was the thing that happens in families when love and fear combine with a long-standing absence of honest conversation about difficult subjects. The fear was real. The love was real. The absence of the conversation was also real, and I had contributed to it as much as they had. What they built from those three elements, love, fear, silence, was a plan that felt to them like care, and felt to me like the removal of my voice from a decision about my own life. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and if you've ever been in a family where two true things existed simultaneously, and nobody had the tools to hold both of them in the same room, you understand how much damage the gap between them can cause without anyone intending damage. If this story is landing somewhere, if there's something in the shape of this day that feels familiar from either side of it, stay with me. Because what happened in the hours after this conversation changed the direction of everything. And the direction it changed toward was not the one any of us would have predicted from inside that living room. Peter said, "There's something else." We all looked at him. He said, "About the residence Nathan chose. Why he chose that specific one." Nathan said, "Peter, let me say it," Peter said. "Let me say it." For the second time that day, with the same quality of decision that produced the first time. He said, "The residence is about 40 minutes from a mountain community with a cluster of small cottages, the same area Dad was researching." I looked at my youngest son. He said, "Nathan found it on your browser history, Dad, when he was at the house in April, after he read the letter. He went to the computer to look something up, and the history was there. The cottages you'd been looking at, the community website. He saw it." I said, "Nathan." Nathan said, "I didn't tell you because I thought..." "What did you think?" He was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind that means something is being genuinely considered rather than simply delayed. Then he said, "I thought if you knew I'd seen it, you'd know that I knew you'd been thinking about leaving. And then you'd ask me why I hadn't just talked to you about it. And I didn't have a good answer for that. You still don't, I said. No, he said. I don't. There it was, the real center of the thing. Not the letter from 1979, not the plan, not the folder or the itinerary or the box. The simple and devastating fact that Nathan had seen evidence that his father was already thinking about moving on. And instead of saying, "Dad, I saw what you were looking at and I want to talk about it," he had built a plan around the information without mentioning that he had it. He had known. He had known that I was researching the same area where he'd arranged a place for me to stay. He had known, and he had said nothing. And the nothing had become the plan. And the plan had become a birthday morning with a cake and unlighted candles and a box packed in my own handwriting. I said, "You chose a residence near the mountains because you'd seen what I was looking at." Nathan said, "I thought I was giving you what you wanted," without asking me if it was what I wanted. Yes. I sat with that for a long moment. The afternoon light in the living room was the specific quality of October in Asheville. The mountains visible from the window, the particular warmth of a fall day that hasn't yet surrendered to the cold that's coming, the light that makes this valley what it is in this season in a way that I have never found anywhere else and have never stopped being grateful for finding when I was young enough to stay. I said, "The cottage I was looking at is not the residence in your itinerary." Nathan said, "I know. I thought the residence would be less isolated," I said. "More supported," he said. Nathan. I looked at my eldest son, 51 years old, a man who had his mother's organizational mind and my own stubbornness, and a quality of genuine care for the people he loved that had, in this situation, expressed itself in exactly the wrong form. The cottage I was looking at was my choice. I made it after 8 months of thinking. I had visited twice. I had done the math. I had thought about what I needed and what I wanted and how those two things overlapped. And I was going to tell you about it today. On my birthday. At this table. He looked at me. "You just got there first," I said. "With a different plan." The window showed the mountains. The cake on the counter had unlighted candles. And outside, beside the front door, the cardboard box sat with my name on it in my own handwriting, packed not by someone preparing my exit from the house, but by me, preparing my entrance into the next chapter, the chapter I had been building toward quietly and alone for 8 months, and that had arrived at the same moment as the plan built on the letter from 1979 and the browser history from April. Peter said, "Tell them about the scholarship." Nathan and Caroline looked at me. I said, "There's something else you don't know about the house." And what I told them next, about what I had intended to do with the money from selling it, about the conversation I had had with the technical college, about the specific idea that had been developing in parallel with the cottage research, and that was, in fact, the most important thing I'd been planning, changed the shape of the afternoon one more time, not toward resolution, not yet, toward something more complicated than resolution, toward the beginning of an actual conversation, the one we should have started having years ago. I told them about the scholarship, not all at once, not as a prepared presentation, not with the organized delivery of someone who has rehearsed. I told it the way you tell things when you've been carrying them privately for a long time, and the carrying has finally ended, and you're simply letting the weight down in front of the people who should have known about it sooner. I told them about the technical college on the west side of Asheville, about the program there that trains younger people in signal systems and railway maintenance, the kind of practical, hands-on technical work that I had spent 40 years doing, and that was becoming harder to find people trained for because the industry had changed and the pathways into it had narrowed. I told them that I had been in contact with the department head there for about 5 months, that we had discussed the possibility of establishing a small scholarship fund, not large, not an endowment of the kind that requires institutional architecture and its own management committee, but a specific and practical annual award that would cover certification costs and training materials for someone who otherwise wouldn't have the means to pursue the credential. The scholarship was to be named for Ellen. I had not told anyone about that part. When I said it, Caroline put her hand over her mouth. Not dramatically, the small, contained gesture of a woman receiving something that requires physical acknowledgement. I said, "The house is worth enough, sold at the right time to establish the fund with 5 years of awards and leave something remaining." I had spoken to a financial advisor about the structure. I had spoken to the college about the criteria. I had a name for it and a framework, and the only thing I hadn't done was tell any of you. The room was completely still. Nathan said, "You were going to sell the house?" "Yes." "And use the money for a scholarship?" "Yes." "And move to a cottage near the mountains?" "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. I said, "That was my plan for my birthday. I was going to have dinner with the 3 of you, and I was going to tell you all of it. The cottage, the scholarship, what I wanted the next years to look like. I had a bottle of wine I'd been saving. I had thought about how the conversation would go. I looked at the table. I thought it would be a good evening." Nathan looked at his hands. He is 51 years old, and he has his mother's way of going entirely still when he's processing something that has landed harder than he anticipated. Ellen did that. The quality of stillness that is not absence, but the opposite of it. The concentrated presence of someone giving something their full attention. It was one of the things I loved about her. That stillness, and seeing it in Nathan, has always produced in me a complicated warmth. He said, "I made a plan for your life based on a letter you wrote at 27 and a browser history I wasn't supposed to see." "Yes," I said. "And you had a plan already?" "Yes." "A better one?" "A different one," I said. "Whether it's better depends on things we haven't fully discussed yet." He looked up. "I mean that," I said. "I'm not telling you this to prove that I was right and you were wrong. I'm telling you this because you needed to know it before we could have a real conversation about any of it, the one we should have been having for a year." Caroline said, "The scholarship." I looked at her. It's Mom," she said. "That's—" She stopped. The organized calm she maintained through most difficult situations had reached its limit, not with grief exactly, but with the specific quality of being surprised by love. Encountering something done out of love when you had been braced for conflict. It produces a different kind of response. I said, "She spent her whole life making sure other people had what they needed. She would have thought a scholarship was... She would have said it was practical. She hated things that were just sentimental without function." Caroline almost smiled. "She would have said you were being dramatic." "She definitely would have," I said. "And then she would have been on the phone with the college the next morning with 12 questions about the selection process." Peter said, "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said today." For a moment, the room had the quality of a room where the weight has shifted, not lifted, not resolved, but redistributed in a way that allowed people to breathe more easily. Then Nathan said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "The cottage, the one near Weaverville. Did you visit it alone?" "Both times," I said. "You drove out there by yourself, looked at it, made a decision." "I made a provisional decision," I said. "I was going to make the final decision after I talked to you." "But you went alone," he said. Not as a criticism. I could hear that clearly. As something else. As a person piecing together a picture and identifying the piece that explained something he'd been carrying. I said, "Yes." He said, "Dad, I found that browser history and I thought you were researching these places because you were worried. Because you were trying to figure out contingency plans in case you had to leave. In case something happened with your health or you couldn't manage, or I thought you were scared and you weren't telling us." I looked at my son. "I thought you were going out to look at those places alone because you didn't want to tell us how worried you were," he said. "And the letter, the one about not wanting to be a burden. I read that and I thought, this is still who he is. A man who would rather go quietly than admit he needed us to think about this with him. A pause. "I was wrong," he said. "You weren't scared. You were planning." "I was both," I said. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive. I was planning because I wasn't scared. If I'd been only scared, I wouldn't have been able to plan." I paused, but I also wasn't ready to have the conversation until I understood what I wanted, because I've watched what happens when someone raises a subject before they know their own position on it. The conversation takes a shape based on the uncertainty rather than the substance. I needed to know what I actually wanted before I asked anyone else to engage with it. Nathan said, "So you kept it private until you were certain?" "Yes." "Which is exactly what I did," he said. "I kept the plan private until I was certain enough to present it. I looked at my eldest son. He said, 'We're the same.'" "In that specific way," I said. "Yes." He didn't smile, but something in his expression changed. The specific change of a person recognizing themselves in something that simultaneously explains and implicates them. Here is where I want to be honest about something that the story requires. I had been hurt by what my children had done. I want to be clear about that because it's true, and because pretending otherwise would be the kind of performance that doesn't serve anyone. The birthday breakfast and the birthday dinner with the unlighted candles and the folder and the reservation and the box packed in my own handwriting, all of it had produced something in me that is painful to name precisely because the people who caused it are people I love. It had produced the feeling of having been already finished by the people who hadn't yet lost you. That's the most accurate thing I can say. They had organized my departure before I had told them I was leaving. They had decided when the next chapter would begin before I had finished the current one. They had looked at me, at 76 years of living in one place, at the quietness of my life since Ellen died, at the letter from 1979, and they had assembled a story about who I was and what I needed, and the story they assembled was not cruel, but it was incomplete, and its incompleteness had taken from me the thing I valued most. Not the house. The right to say what happened next. I want you to understand that, because it's the thing that matters most about this day and about what followed from it. I did not fight to stay in the house. I was already planning to leave it. I did not fight the idea of change. I was the one who had initiated change in my own thinking. I did not fight my children's concern for me, because the concern was genuine and I understood it. What I fought for, quietly and without drama, at a dining table on my 76th birthday with a cake on the counter and unlighted candles, was the sentence that said, "I am still the person who decides." That sentence is worth whatever it costs to preserve. If you're watching this story and you recognize something in it, if you've been the parent at the table or the adult who made a plan in good faith that hurt someone they loved, I want you to stay with the rest of it. Because what happened next is the part that required the most from all of us. I said, "I want to visit the residence." Nathan looked at me. I said, "The one you reserved. I want to go and see it." "Dad, not to move in," I said. "To understand why you chose it. What you saw when you looked at it that made you think it was the right place. I want to understand the plan from your side." He was quiet. "You spent months thinking about my future," I said. "I want to know what you thought it looked like." Caroline said, "We can go now if you want." "Tomorrow," I said. "Today I'd like to eat the birthday cake." Peter said, "The candles." "Yes," I said. "Light the candles." We ate the birthday cake at the kitchen table, the four of us, in the way that birthday cakes are best eaten, without occasion having been fully resolved, without the conversation being complete, with things still in the air that needed more time than one afternoon could provide. The presents were opened. The cards were read. Nathan had written something in his card that I read and folded and put in my shirt pocket without commenting on, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too important for the moment it had arrived in and needed to be read again later in a quieter place. The drives to the residence the next day produced something I hadn't anticipated. The place was nothing like what I had imagined from the description in the itinerary. I had pictured, and I want to be honest about this, because my picture had been shaped partly by resistance, something institutional, a managed space, a place where older adults were organized rather than living, a place that communicated, through its architecture and its operations, that the people inside it were done with the part of life that required agency. What I found was different. The residence was quiet and well-maintained, on a property with mountain views and a garden that someone tended with genuine attention. The people who lived there were not uniform in any respect that I could identify. There was a man reading on a bench outside who looked up when we arrived and said something dry about the October light that made Peter laugh. There was a woman in the common room who was working on what appeared to be a significant woodworking project, and who explained when I asked that she'd taken it up at 72 and found it more satisfying than anything she'd done in her career. I sat with her for about 20 minutes while Nathan and Caroline talked to the administrator. Her name was Dorothy, 78 years old, a retired professor of environmental science who had moved to the residence 2 years earlier after her husband died. She told me, with the directness of someone who has stopped managing other people's comfort around difficult subjects, that she had been furious when her daughter suggested it, that she had been certain it was the wrong decision, that she had spent the first 6 months proving to herself that it was wrong, and then, at some point, she had stopped proving. She said, "I wasn't wrong that I didn't want to be here. I was wrong that being here would be what I thought it would be." I said, "What did you think it would be?" She said, "The end of my own story. Turns out it's just a different chapter." I thought about that on the drive back. I thought about chapters, and about the particular mistake of believing that a chapter is an ending when it is simply the space after one thing and before the next. When we got back to the house, I sat with my children at the kitchen table again. I said, "I'm not moving into the residence." Nathan started to speak. "Let me finish," I said. "I'm not moving into the residence, but I want you to understand that I didn't say that because it was a bad place. It wasn't. I said it because it wasn't what I had planned. And the difference between those two things matters enormously to me." He nodded. "What I am going to do," I said, "is what I was already planning to do. I am going to sell this house. I am going to establish the scholarship. I am going to move to a cottage near the mountains that I chose myself, for reasons I am going to explain to each of you in detail, because I am done with the silence that allowed us to arrive at this birthday." I looked at each of them. "But I'm going to do all of that with you knowing about it, and with you being allowed to have opinions about it, and with us having the conversation that we should have been having for at least a year." Nathan said, "Okay." I said, "That's it? Okay?" He said, "You had a plan. A good one. I had a plan. It wasn't the right one. We're at the table having the conversation we should have had earlier. Okay is the right response." I looked at my eldest son for a long moment. Then I said, "Your mother would have come to the same conclusion significantly faster." He said, "She would have had the conversation a year ago. At least." Caroline said, "She would have asked you directly at Sunday dinner." "Probably at Tuesday dinner," I said. "She didn't always wait for Sunday." Peter said, "I have a question." We looked at him. He said, "The cottage near Weaverville. Can we see it?" I said, "Saturday?" He said, "Saturday." We went on Saturday, all four of us. In Nathan's car because it was the largest, which meant Nathan drove and I sat in the passenger seat and Caroline and Peter were in the back the way they'd been on family drives for their entire lives, which is a specific kind of comfortable that I don't have another word for. We drove out of Asheville and into the mountains on a morning that had the quality October mornings have in western North Carolina, When the color is still near its peak and the air is cold enough to be serious and the light comes in at the angle that makes everything look like it has been considered. The cottage was everything I had understood it would be from 2 visits alone. Small, practical, built for one person who knew what they needed. A covered porch facing the tree line, a kitchen that required thought rather than indulgence. A study with enough light and enough space for the specific activities that had come to define my retired life. A garden area that required attention without requiring daily labor. And from the porch, the mountains in the middle distance in the specific way that the mountains appear from elevated ground west of Asheville. Not towering and dramatic, but present and continuous. A frame around the world rather than an intrusion into it. Nathan stood on the porch for a long time. He said, "It's good." "Yes," I said. "You knew what you were looking for." "I took my time," I said. 8 months. He looked at the mountains. He said, "Dad." "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask you." The words had the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to be said, and that had found finally the right moment and the right form and the right person to receive them. Not an elaborate apology. Not a reconstructed explanation or a careful positioning of responsibility. Just the actual sentence said plainly by a man who had spent his career managing things and had made the mistake of managing one thing that wasn't his to manage. I said, "I'm sorry I made it so difficult to ask." He looked at me. I said, "I spent years being the person who didn't need anything. I believed that was what a good father did. What I actually did was make it impossible for you to see me as someone who could be asked. If you can't ask your father what he wants because your father has never seemed to want anything, you don't develop the habit of asking. And then when circumstances change, you don't have the habit. You have something else. You have a folder and a reservation and a birthday morning that went wrong." Nathan said, "I should have developed the habit anyway." "Yes," I said, "and so should I." The cottage accepted both of those things. Neither of us pushed further. There are moments in a relationship where the truth has been named completely enough to move forward on, and this was one of them. The months that followed had the specific quality of things that change in the way real things change, not dramatically, not all at once, not with the clean resolution of a situation that has been resolved and filed away. The house on Briarwood Lane was listed in November. The scholarship was formally established at the college in December, with a small ceremony that Nathan organized and that Peter photographed, and that Caroline made sure included the right people from the college and from the community who had known Ellen. The scholarship was announced at the ceremony as the Ellen Harlan Award for Technical Excellence. Caroline gave a brief speech about her mother, that she had written herself, and that I had read in advance and approved, and that was, in its specific combination of accuracy and warmth, exactly what Ellen would have considered appropriate. Not too much, not a performance, the truth of someone, said plainly, by a person who had loved them. I moved to the cottage in February, not in the winter urgency of someone fleeing a situation, but in the considered pace of someone who has decided what they're doing and is doing it correctly. I packed what I intended to take. I arranged what would go to Nathan and Caroline and Peter. I organized what would go to the various people and places that made more sense than family. And on the day I left the house at 42 Briarwood Lane, I went through every room. I stood in the kitchen where my children had prepared a birthday breakfast. I stood in the living room where the conversation had happened that had needed to happen for a year. I stood in the study where the wooden box sat on the shelf that had held the letter and the notebook and everything else that had been private. For too long. I took the box. I stood in the dining room last. I touched the table. I thought about the unlighted candles on the birthday cake, which seemed, from the distance of several months, like the most accurate metaphor for what that day had been. The light that was ready to be lit, but hadn't been yet. The celebration that was present and waiting for the moment that was slightly delayed. The moment had come, just later than anyone expected, and in a different form, and preceded by a conversation that was difficult and necessary, and that we were all better for having had. I looked at the dining room for a long time. Then I turned off the light. I moved into the cottage on a Wednesday. By Saturday, my children knew the address. On Sunday, Nathan called. He said, "How's the porch?" I said, "Come and see." He said, "Next weekend." He came next weekend. Caroline came the one after. Peter came from Tennessee the weekend after that, with his camera, and spent an afternoon making photographs of the mountains from the porch and from the trail behind the property. And some of them were very good, and one of them I put on the wall of the study where I could see it from my chair. We had established something new, not the relationship we'd had before. That one had been built on certain assumptions that were no longer accurate and that we'd collectively decided to stop maintaining. Something different. A relationship where Nathan asked what I wanted before he organized something around me. Where Caroline brought difficult subjects to the table instead of managing them from a distance. Where Peter didn't wait until the last possible moment to say the thing that needed to be said. And where I told them things. Not everything. There is a privacy appropriate to any person's inner life that should not be surrendered in the name of communication, but the things that affected them, the things they needed to know to understand me, rather than to construct a version of me from incomplete information. The things that, kept private, would allow fear and assumption to fill the gap. I had spent decades believing that keeping my own counsel was the highest form of responsibility. That being the person who handled things silently and reliably was what a father was supposed to be. What I had actually been doing, at least in part, was keeping the people I loved at a distance that felt like dignity, but functioned like isolation. The cottage is quiet in the specific way of mountain mornings. I wake before sunrise and sit on the porch and drink coffee and watch the trees become visible as the light arrives. The mountains are there every morning in the middle distance, the same mountains I've been watching from various places in western North Carolina for 42 years, permanent in the way that only very old things manage to be permanent, not unchanging, because they change continuously if you look closely enough, but continuous. Present, the reliable background against which everything else happens. On my 76th birthday, I thought my children had gathered to take my home away from me. What they had actually gathered to do was something more frightened and more loving than that. They had gathered because they were terrified of what getting older meant. For me, for them, for the specific future that would eventually arrive when the person who had always handled things could no longer handle all of them. And they had expressed that terror in the only language they had available: a plan, a folder, a reservation. They had not known that I was already building a plan. They had not known because I had not told them, and I had not told them because they had not asked, and they had not asked because I had spent 40 years making clear without stating it that I was not a person who needed to be asked. We were all right about something. We were all wrong about something. The difference, at the end of all of it, was that we finally sat at the same table with the same information and arrived at something that was ours rather than one person's or another's. I did leave that house, but nobody took it from me. I chose the door. I chose the date. I chose where I would go next. And for the first time in years, my children didn't plan my future for me. They sat at a table and asked one simple question: "Dad, what do you want?" At 76, that question felt more like a birthday present than anything they could have wrapped. The candles on the birthday cake, the ones that sat unlit while Nathan slid the folder across the table, the ones that waited through the afternoon conversation, and the drive to the residence and everything that came after, those candles were eventually lit. Not on that birthday. On the following one. My 77th birthday at the cottage, with the mountains visible from the porch, and my 3 children in the kitchen making the same kind of breakfast they'd made the year before. Nathan's car in the driveway, Caroline's laugh from inside, the one she uses when something is genuinely funny rather than the one she uses when she's managing. Peter, outside with his camera before anyone else was ready, making photographs of the light on the mountains. And this time, when Caroline said, "Dad, today is going to be different," I believed her. Not because circumstances were perfect, because we were finally having the same conversation. If this story touched something in you, if you've been the parent at the table or the adult who made a plan in good faith that went wrong, or the one who stayed quiet when the quiet was costing everyone something, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part of Walter's story you recognized. Tell me about the conversation your family hasn't had yet. Tell me about the birthday that went sideways, or the plan that was built on a letter from decades ago, or the moment someone finally asked you the right question after years of everyone assuming they already knew the answer. Those stories matter, every single one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want to keep coming back to, the kind that tells the truth about what families actually look like when love and fear and silence and courage are all present at the same time, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you're there when the next one arrives. Every story I bring you is built the same way Walter built his plan for the cottage. Slowly, with attention to what matters, with respect for the people involved, and with the understanding that the best endings are the ones where everyone at the table finally knows what everyone else has been thinking. I'll see you in the next one.